Most people assume that police have always been part of American life, that law enforcement is simply a natural feature of how a functioning society works. It feels obvious. It feels permanent, like roads, courts, or schools, something that was always there and always necessary. But when you actually look at the historical record, when departments were created, in which cities they first appeared, and what specific problems they were supposedly designed to solve, something doesn't quite line up. The timeline raises questions that the standard explanation doesn't fully answer. The first formal, organized police department in the United States appeared in Boston in 1838. Before that point, American cities relied on much smaller and much more informal systems. There were night watchmen who patrolled streets after dark. There were sheriffs appointed to handle local disputes. There were constables responsible for specific tasks in specific areas. These systems were limited. They were not coordinated. They did not resemble anything close to a modern police force. And for a long time, that was considered enough. Cities functioned, laws were enforced, at least to some degree. Society moved forward. Then something changed. Within just a few decades after Boston established its department, fully organized police forces began appearing in cities across the country. New York followed. New Orleans followed. Philadelphia, Chicago, and others came shortly after. What is worth noting here is not just that these departments were created, but how quickly it happened. This was not a slow, gradual shift spread across a century. It was a concentrated period of institutional change. Major cities, within a relatively short window of time, all arrived at the same conclusion, that the old informal systems were no.
The standard history taught in most schools presents a fairly clean and straightforward explanation. American cities expanded rapidly during the 1800s. More people meant more complexity. More complexity meant more disorder. And more disorder meant that the old informal systems, the night watchmen, the constables, the local sheriffs, were simply no longer capable of keeping up. So city governments responded by building something more organized, more permanent, and more structured. Police departments were created to maintain order and protect the growing population. That is the explanation most people have heard. And on the surface, it sounds entirely reasonable. It sounds like a practical institution responding to a practical problem. But there is a problem with this explanation, and it becomes visible the moment you look at where organized law enforcement actually appeared first. Not in the large, rapidly growing northern cities, but in the South. In cities like Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, organized patrol systems were operating decades before cities like Boston or New York had anything comparable in structure or scale. This is a detail that the standard explanation tends to pass over quickly, but it matters, because if the driving force behind organized policing was urban growth and rising crime, then the most developed early systems should have appeared in the places experiencing the most urban growth, and that is not what the historical record shows. These southern patrol systems were not built to address crime in the way most people understand that word today. They were not responding to theft or violence between strangers or the general disorder of a crowded city. They had a very specific and clearly documented function. They were designed to monitor, control, and restrict the movement of enslaved people. Patrol members were all.
To understand what was really happening during this period, it helps to step back and look at the broader conditions of American society in the 1800s. This was not a stable or quiet time. It was a period of rapid and often disruptive change. Industrialization was reshaping the economy in ways that had never been seen before. Factories were replacing small workshops. Cities were filling with workers who had left farms and rural communities in search of wages. New forms of wealth were being created at a scale that was genuinely unprecedented. But that wealth was not being distributed evenly. Factory owners, merchants, and large landowners were accumulating significant economic power. And the gap between those at the top and those doing the physical labor to generate that wealth was growing wider with each passing decade. This is the background against which organized policing developed in American cities.
and it is a background that the standard explanation tends to leave out. The concern driving many city governments during this period was not simply crime in the way most people understand it today. It was something more specific. It was labor. Workers in factories and industrial sites were beginning to organize. They were gathering together, sharing grievances, and in many cases refusing to continue working under conditions they considered dangerous or exploitative. Strikes were becoming more frequent. In some cities, large groups of workers would stop work entirely, sometimes for days at a time, demanding better pay or safer conditions. This created a serious problem, not for public safety in any broad sense, but for the business owners and employers who depended on that labor to generate profit. And those business owners were often closely connected to the city governments making decisions about how law enforcement should operate. This raises questions about whose interests were actually being protected when police departments were deployed during these situations.
When you examine the historical record carefully, not just in one city, but across many cities, over many decades, a pattern begins to take shape. And it is a pattern that is difficult to reconcile with the standard explanation of what police departments were created to do. The official story describes policing as a public service, an institution built to protect all residents equally, reduce crime, and maintain order for the benefit of everyone living in a city. That is the framing most people are familiar with. But the actual documented history of how early police departments operated tells a more complicated story. Protection was not distributed equally, enforcement was not applied consistently, and the differences were not random. They followed clear and repeated lines of class, race, and neighborhood. City after city, decade after decade, the same divisions appear in the records. In wealthier neighborhoods, police presence functioned largely as it was described in official accounts. Officers were available, response was relatively reliable. Residents in those areas could reasonably expect that the institution existed at least in part to serve their interests. But in poorer areas, particularly neighborhoods with large immigrant populations or large black populations, the experience of policing looked very different. In those communities, police presence did not consistently mean protection. It often meant surveillance. It meant enforcement of laws that seemed designed less to prevent harm and more to manage the presence of people that wealthier residents found uncomfortable or threatening simply by existing in public spaces. This raises questions that the standard explanation struggles to answer. If the mission was equal protection, why does the documented reality diverge so consistently from that stated mission, depending entirely on where a person lived? But this is where it becomes unclear.
So, after looking at the timeline, the early patrol systems, the labor disputes, the vagrancy laws, and the consistent patterns of unequal enforcement, where does all of this actually leave us? That is the question worth sitting with at this point, because the evidence gathered across the previous chapters does not point cleanly in one direction. It does not produce a single, clear conclusion that everyone examining the record agrees on. What it produces instead is a set of competing explanations, each one supported by real evidence, each one limited in important ways, and none of them fully capable of accounting for everything the historical record contains. This is not an unusual situation when studying complex historical institutions, but it is worth being honest about. The question of why American policing was really created is not settled. And the fact that it remains unsettled, despite significant research, is itself something worth paying attention to. The first explanation, and perhaps the most direct one, is that police departments were created primarily as instruments of social control, not to protect all citizens equally, but to protect the interests of those who held economic and political power. The evidence supporting this view is substantial. The Southern slave patrols represent the earliest organized enforcement systems on record, and their purpose was explicitly about controlling a specific population rather than preventing crime in any general sense. The deployment of early Northern police forces against striking workers points in a similar direction. The uneven application of vagrancy laws reinforces it further. Taken together, these pieces of evidence suggest a pattern of institutional design that served narrow interests rather than broad public safety. But this is where it becomes unclear, because this explanation, as compelling as parts of it are,
does not account for every department in every city. There were genuine public safety functions being performed. There were real crimes being investigated. The social control explanation captures something important, but it does not capture everything. The second explanation takes a different position. It argues that policing in America grew out of genuine